everybody. Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are picking up the beginning of Chapter 6 of An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Remember, if you like the episode, if you like the show, hit that like and subscribe button. The chapter starts with an interesting quotation. The settler's work is to make even dreams of liberty impossible for the native. The native's work is to imagine all possible methods for destroying the settler. France Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. In 1803, the Jefferson administration, without consulting any affected indigenous nation, purchased the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte. Louisiana comprised 828,000 square miles, and its addition doubled the size of the United States. The territory encompassed all or part of multiple indigenous nations, including the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Pawnee, Osage, and Comanche, among other peoples of the Bison. It also included the area that would soon be designated Indian Territory, Oklahoma, the site of relocation of indigenous peoples from west of the Mississippi. 15 future states would emerge from the taking, all of present-day Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, Minnesota west of the Mississippi, most of North and South Dakota, northeastern New Mexico and North Texas, the portions of Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado east of the Continental Divide, and Louisiana west of the Mississippi River, including the city of New Orleans. The territory pressed against lands occupied by Spain, including Texas and all the territory west of the Continental Divide to the Pacific Ocean. These would soon be next on the U.S. annexation list. At the time, many U.S. Americans saw this purchase as a strategic means of averting war with France while securing commerce on the Mississippi. But it was not long before some began eyeing it for settlement, and others proposing an exchange of indigenous lands in the Old Northwest and Old Southwest for lands west of the Mississippi. Before turning to conquest and colonization west of the Mississippi, the slavery-based rule of the Southeast would be ethnically cleansed of indigenous peoples. The man for the job was Andrew Jackson. Career building through genocide. Neither superior technology nor an overwhelming number of settlers made up the mainspring of the birth of the United States or the spread of its power over the entire world. Rather, the chief cause was the colonialist settler states' willingness to eliminate whole civilizations of people in order to possess their lands. This trend of extermination became common in the 20th century as the United States seized military and economic control of the world, capping 500 years of European colonization and imperialism. The canny Prussian Otto von Bismarck, founder and first chancellor of the German Empire, 1871 to 1890, was prescient in observing the colonization of North America has been the decisive fact of the modern world. Jefferson was its architect. Andrew Jackson was the implementer of the final solution for the indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi. Andrew Jackson was an influential Tennessee land speculator, politician, and wealthy owner of a slave-worked plantation, the Hermitage. He was also a veteran Indian killer. Jackson's family personified the Protestant Scots-Irish migration to the borderlands of empires. Jackson's Scots-Irish parents and two older brothers arrived in Pennsylvania from County Antrim in Northern Ireland in 1765. The Jacksons soon moved to a Scots-Irish community on the North Carolina border with South Carolina. Jackson's father died after a logging accident a few weeks before Andrew's birth in 1767. Life was hard for a single mother and 3 children on the frontier. At age 13, with little education, Jackson became a courier for the local regiment of the frontier secessionists in their War of Independence from Britain. Jackson's mother and his brothers died during the war, leaving him an orphan. He worked at various jobs, then studied law, and was admitted to the bar in the Western District of North Carolina, which would later become the state of Tennessee. Through his legal work, most of which related to disputed land claims, he acquired a plantation near Nashville, worked by 150 slaves. He helped usher in Tennessee as a state in 1796 and was elected as its U.S. Senator, an office he quit a year later to become a judge in the Tennessee Supreme Court for 6 years. It's a really strange career choice, don't you think? Still, it worked for the man. As the most notorious land speculator in western Tennessee, Jackson enriched himself by acquiring a portion of the Chickasaw Nation's land. It was in 1801 that Jackson first took command of the Tennessee militia as a colonel and began his Indian-killing military career. After his brutal war of annihilation against the Muskogee Nation, Jackson continued building his national military and political career by tackling the resistant Seminoles in what are known as the Seminole Wars. In 1836, during the second of these wars, U.S. Army General Thomas S. Jessup captured the popular Anglo attitude toward the Seminoles. The country can be rid of them only by exterminating them. By then, Jackson was finishing his second term as the most popular president in U.S. history to that date. That's just mind-boggling. And the policy of genocide was embedded in the highest office of the U.S. government. In the Southeast, the Choctaws and Chickasaws turned exclusively to U.S. traders once the new U.S. Republic effectively cut off access to the Spanish in Florida. Soon they were trapped in the U.S. trading world, in which they would run up debts and then have no way to pay other than by ceding land to creditors, who were often acting as agents of the federal government. This was no accidental outcome, but was foreseen and encouraged by Jefferson. In fact, that sounds like fraud to me. In 1805, the Choctaws ceded most of their lands to the United States for $50,000. And the Chickasaws relinquished all their lands north of the Tennessee River for $20,000. Many Choctaws and Chickasaws thus became landless participants in the expanding plantation economy, burdened by debt and poverty. The division of the Muskogee Creek Nation and the rise of Andrew Jackson as a result led to his eventual elevation to the presidency and carrying out the final solution, elimination of all the indigenous communities east of the Mississippi through forced removal. After the Choctaws and Chickasaws lost most of their territories, only the Muskogees continued to resist the United States. The Muskogee Nation was a federation of autonomous towns located in the valleys of the many rivers that crisscross what are now the states of Alabama, Tennessee, and parts of Georgia and Florida. The lower creeks inhabited and farmed in the eastern part of this region, watered by the Chattahoochee, Flint, and Apalachicola rivers. Apalachicola. I'm going with Apalachicola rivers. While the upper creeks lived west of them in the valleys of the Coosa, Tallapoosa, and Alabama rivers. Following U.S. independence, the Muskogees were divided by settler colonialism. Lower Creek villages became economically dependent on settlers and emulated settlers' values, including ownership of African slaves, which is interesting. They pit us against each other, the wealthy elites. They always have. This was largely due to 2 decades of diligent work on the part of U.S. Indian agent Benjamin Hawkins. He was in charge of the U.S. government's civilization project, lending the settler moniker 5 civilized tribes to describe the great agricultural nations of the Southeast. Hawkins' mission was to instill Euro-American values and practices in indigenous peoples, including the profit motive, privatization of property, debt, accumulation of wealth by a few, and slavery, allowing settlers to gain the land and assimilate the Muskogees. At the time of independence, hundreds of settlers were squatting illegally on lands of Muskogees of the lower creek towns, and that is where Hawkins concentrated, leaving the Muskogees upriver alone. However, traditionalists among the upper creeks who had allied with Tecumseh and the Shawnee Confederation understood that they would be next, as they saw the 20-year Hawkins project transforming some citizens of the lower creek towns into wealthy plantation and slave owners, while the majority became landless and poor. Traditionalist fighters called Red Sticks, due to the color of their wooden spears, began an offensive against collaborating upper creeks and settlers that ended in civil war during 1813. The Red Sticks created chaos that affected Hawkins' scheme, as they attacked anyone associated with his program. Their effectiveness, however, provoked a genocidal counteroffensive not officially authorized by the federal government, led by Andrew Jackson, who was then head of the Tennessee militias. Jackson threatened to form his own mercenary army to drive the Muskogees into the ocean if the government failed to eradicate the insurgents, although Jackson and his fellow Tennesseans made it clear that their goal was extermination of the Muskogee Nation. Their rhetoric claimed self-defense. in a series of search and destroy missions over 3 months prior to the final assault on the Red Sticks. Jackson's mercenaries killed hundreds of Muskogee citizens, pursuing without mercy even homeless and starved refugees seeking shelter and safety. By this point, the Red Sticks had killed most of the Muskogee Nation livestock, both to deprive U.S. soldiers of food and to rid Muskogee culture of the colonizers' influence. Both Shawnee fighters and Africans who had freed themselves from slavery allied with the Red Sticks. With all their families, they set up a fortified encampment at Tohopeka, at the Horseshoe Bend on the Tallapoosa River in present-day Alabama. Jackson proceeded to mobilize Lower Creek fighters and some Cherokee allies against the Red Sticks. I almost want to say Red Sox. Sorry, bad joke. In March 1814, with 700 mounted militiamen and 600 Cherokee and Lower Creek fighters, Jackson's armies attacked the Red Sticks' stronghold. The mercenaries captured 300 Red Stick wives and children and held them as hostages to induce the Muskogee surrender. Of 1,000 Red Stick and Allied insurgents, 800 were killed. Wow. Jackson lost 49 men. In the aftermath of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, as it is known in U.S. military annals, Jackson's troops fashioned reins from their horses' bridles from skins stripped from the Muskogee bodies, and they saw to it that souvenirs from the corpses were given to the ladies of Tennessee. Wow. Following the slaughter, Jackson justified his troops' actions. The fiends of the Tallapoosa will no longer murder our women and children or disturb the quiet of our borders. They have disappeared from the face of the earth. How lamentable is it that the path to peace should lead through blood and over the carcasses of the slain. But it is in the dispensation of that providence which inflicts partial evil to produce general good. Horseshoe Bend marked the end of the Muskogees' resistance in their original homeland. As historian Alan Brinkley has observed, Jackson's political fortunes depended on the fate of the Indians, that is, their eradication. The surrender document the Muskogee Nation was forced to sign in 1814, the Treaty of Fort Jackson, asserted that they had lost under principles of national justice and honorable war. Andrew Jackson, the only U.S. negotiator of the treaty, insisted on nothing less than the total destruction of the Muskogee Nation, which the Muskogees had no power to refuse or negotiate. These terms of total surrender shocked the small group of Muskogee plantation and slave owners who thought that they had been thoroughly accepted by the U.S. Americans. They had fought alongside the Anglo militias against the majority Red Sticks in the war just concluded, yet all Muskogees were now to be punished equally. To no avail did the friendlies prostrate themselves before Jackson at the treaty meeting, begging that they and their holdings be spared. Jackson told them that the extreme punishment exacted upon them should teach all those who would try to oppose U.S. domination. We bleed our enemies in such cases, he explained, to give them their senses. Military historian Grenier observes that Jackson's bleeding of the Muskogees marks a culminating point in American military history as the end of the Trans-Appalachian East Indian Wars. The conquest of the West was not guaranteed by defeating the British Army in battle in 1815, but by defeating and driving the Indians from their homelands. The treaty obliged surviving Muskogees to move onto western remnants of their homelands, and Jackson, far from being reprimanded for his genocidal methods, won a commission from President James Madison as Major General in the U.S. Army. The territory that would become Alabama and Mississippi now lay open to Anglo-American settlement. An ominous green light to the expansion of plantation slavery. Is it possible to become dyslexic as you get older? That was a weird one. Ominous. I keep having these little dyslexic moments. That's another story, though. The Muskogee War thus inscribed a U.S. policy of ethnic cleansing onto an entire indigenous population. The policy originated by Andrew Jackson in that war would be reconfirmed politically when he became president in 1828. The Upper Creek Muskogees, who remained in Alabama, surrendered to Jackson and ceded 23 million acres of their ancestral lands to the United States in the Treaty of Fort Jackson. The Red Sticks, however, joined the resistant Seminole Nation in the Florida Everglades, and 3 more decades of Muskogee resistance ensued. During this period, Anglo-American slave owners, and Andrew Jackson in particular, were determined to destroy the safe havens that Seminole towns offered to Americans who escaped from slavery. The Seminole Nation had not existed under that name prior to European colonization. The ancestral towns of the indigenous people who became known as Seminoles were located along rivers in a large area of what is today Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and the Florida Panhandle. In the mid-18th century, Wakapuchisi, cowkeeper, and his people separated from the Coweta Muskogees and moved south into what was then Spanish-occupied Florida. As Spain, Britain, and later the United States decimated indigenous towns throughout the Southeast, survivors, including self-emancipated Africans, established a refuge in Seminole territory in Spanish Florida in the Everglades. European incursions came in the form of military attacks, disease, and disruption of trade routes, causing collapse and realignments within and between the towns. The Seminole Nation was born of resistance and included the vestiges of dozens of indigenous communities as well as escaped Africans, as the Seminole towns served as refuge. In the Caribbean and Brazil, people in such escapee communities were called Maroons. But in the United States, the liberated Africans were absorbed into Seminole Nation culture. Then, as now, Seminoles spoke the Muskogee language, and much later, in 1957, the U.S. government designated them an Indian tribe. How generous of them. The Seminoles were one of the 5 civilized tribes ordered from their national homelands in the 1830s to Indian Territory, later made part of the state of Oklahoma. The United States waged 3 wars against the Seminole Nation between 1817 and 1858. The prolonged and fierce Second Seminole War was the longest foreign war waged by the United States up to the Vietnam War. Why is that a foreign war? The U.S. military further developed its Army, naval, and marine capabilities in again adopting a counterinsurgency strategy, in this case against the Seminole towns in the Everglades. Once again, U.S. forces targeted civilians, destroyed food supplies, and sought to destroy every last insurgent. What U.S. military annals call the First Seminole War began when U.S. authorities entered Spanish Florida illegally in an attempt to recover U.S. plantation owners' property, former African slaves. The Seminoles repelled the invasion. In 1818, I see that the reason it's a foreign war is because it's Spanish territory at this time. In 1818, President James Monroe ordered Andrew Jackson, then a major general in the U.S. Army, to lead 3,000 soldiers into Florida, Spanish-owned Florida, to crush the Seminoles and retrieve the Africans among them. The expedition destroyed a number of Seminole settlements, and then captured the Spanish fort at Pensacola, bringing down the Spanish government. But it failed in destroying Seminole guerrilla resistance, and the Seminoles did not agree to hand over any former slaves. Armed occupation was the true way of settling a conquered country. Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, and said at the time, reflecting a popular blend of militarism and white supremacist Christian identity. The children of Israel entered the promised land with implements of husbandry in one hand and the weapons of war in the other. The United States annexed Florida as a territory in 1819, opening it to Anglo-American settlement. In 1821, Jackson was appointed military commander of Florida Territory. The Seminoles never sued for peace, were never conquered, and never signed a treaty with the United States. And although some were rounded up and sent in 1832 to Oklahoma, where they were given a land base, the Seminole Nation has never ceased to exist in the Everglades. I dig the ending of that episode. I'm glad you were here to share it with me. Did you like it? If you did, hit that like and subscribe button. See you in the next episode.